Capital One is a technology company that's actually disguised as a bank. Another way to put this, if you were to think of Uber, Uber is a disruptive company that had disrupted the taxi cab industry. And that's really what Capital One wants to do. We want to be disruptive to the rest of the banking industry. So how exactly can we do that? Ben had mentioned about all the award-winning apps and stuff that we have. We can't just create just have a fancy web app or a mobile app. We also need to change the way that we deliver software and all those manual and analog processes on the back end. So in order to do this, we realized that we needed to adopt the DevOps culture and all the principles and use CI/CD to deliver software into production. So with that said, some of the conditions that we were facing in the beginning, we still had physical data centers, and I'm talking around 2015. So we had physical data centers, and Capital One actually made a move to go 100% into the cloud. And we set a strategy to exit all of our data centers within 5 years. And for a company with the size of Capital One, this is actually pretty difficult. The cloud provider that we had chosen was AWS, and this actually made it a lot easier for us to achieve CI/CD, because if you were to look at AWS and many other cloud providers as well, there's APIs pretty much for every single resource. So this allows us to very easily automate, create infrastructure as code, be able to test our infrastructure, and have a repeatable process. So one of the things that we were also facing in the beginning was the lack of automated testing. We had a lot of manual testing that was involved, and you can't have any manual processes if you want to have a fully automated CI/CD pipeline. So we knew we needed to get rid of these manual testing. So we decided to follow behavioral-driven development principles, and we chose to use Cucumber in order to do this. And we got rid of all of our automated testing. Not our automated testing, our manual testing. And then that allows us to be able to fit into a CI/CD pipeline. Originally, there actually was automated testing in the beginning, but we were using some tools that it wouldn't allow itself to fit inside of a pipeline. So that's why we had to change the tooling that we were using. So we also had the lack of automated releases. So at this time, developers were still developing code, pretty much throwing that code over the fence, and it's going to the operations teams. And they had some automation for standard type releases, but not all releases are standard. There may be maybe some additional infrastructure changes that might need to be made, and they don't have any automation for that. So all the releases were being thrown over the fence, and you had to be on a phone call around midnight, and they might go till 8 a.m. in the morning until everything was finished. So we didn't want to follow that anymore. We want to be able to deliver code into production multiple times a day, anytime we want. So we also had a complex change management process. So since we are a heavily regulated industry, there are certain things that we have to adhere to. So any change that goes into production, we have to record that change. And we had a very manual process around how we manage changes. So we have a system where we have to put in what are changes. We have to deploy a change within a certain window. In order for that change to be approved, we have to have a 5-day lead time. We have to get on a phone call, explain what our changes are going to be. None of this fits in a CI/CD pipeline, so we wanted to get away from this. And then we had monolithic monthly releases. This is something that we wanted to go away from because monolithic applications really aren't great for CI/CD. So I'll talk a little bit about that later in the next upcoming slide. But we would do a monthly release on let's say the banking application. And lots of times this would result in a full backout of everything, because maybe your code might be good, but another team's code, maybe they had some bad code that they ended up releasing, and you have to really back out everything. So none of your code would go in during that month. So you could either have to wait for the next month or maybe the next week or something to get your code released. So this is what our environment looked like for the past, current, and future. So back in 2015, we had our on-premise environments, and we also had the cloud. And we wanted to move everything from on-prem into the cloud. So we also had, we were running an open source Jenkins, and this open source Jenkins was still on-premise. And we also had the monolithic design application. So in order for us to really do CI/CD, we knew we wanted to move away from the monolithic design, and we wanted to do more of a microservice architecture approach. This allows us to be able to make smaller changes, not have just one repository that we're all working from. We can have multiple repositories per API, and then be able to deploy small changes in production multiple times a day. So our current state is we ended up moving away from the on-premise Jenkins because at the time, the on-premise Jenkins served its purpose for deploying into the on-prem environment that we had, but we couldn't deploy anything in AWS. And so at the time, like we were actually like working on a smaller team, which was just for the online account opening. And we were tasked to really figure out like the CI/CD. So online account opening was abstracting the entire online account opening process outside of the monolithic banking application that we had and doing a more microservice approach. And so we were tasked to figure out the CI/CD for that. So it was all going to go into AWS, and we couldn't actually utilize the Jenkins that we had at the time because it didn't actually have network connectivity to AWS. So we can access the APIs and deploy stuff into AWS, but not actually like test to see whether it was working. So we decided to spin up our own open source Jenkins, which we called Bank Jenkins. And this was deployed 100% in the cloud, so we can utilize like IAM role assumptions. We had all that network connectivity to test our applications like that we deployed out into AWS. Now, if you see I have in bold, it says all of retail. So there's a point to this. We have 1,500 developers in retail, and when we first built this out, we just thought it was going to be for 30 people. And then everyone found out this team, like they developed like this Jenkins that's in the cloud. We can now deploy stuff into the cloud more quickly. So everyone just like came onto our platform. So we have 1,500 developers with 45,000 jobs that's currently running on Jenkins. This has caused a lot of stability issues for us right now. So the future state is inside Capital One, we do have the enterprise team who is actually hosting CloudBees Jenkins right now. We're actually in the transition of moving over to CloudBees Jenkins because it's going to create much more stability for us. So some of the challenges that we have faced with moving to CI/CD, I said the open source Jenkins, we have no way to scale open source Jenkins. CloudBees will allow us to do that much better, where we can have like a master per team if we wanted to. It'd be much more difficult to do that with open source. One of the other challenges was implementing a fully automated CI/CD pipeline in a heavily regulated environment. Because we are a bank, we have to adhere to those regulations. We have to meet things like separation of duties. So I don't know if anyone knows what separation of duties is, but if you are a developer and you develop a feature, you actually can't deploy that feature into production. You have to have someone else do a code review, and then another person actually has to deploy that into production. So that was something that we had to come over through automation. All changes need to be recorded and approved. This goes back to that Painly change management system that we had to deal with, which was a manual process. So we ended up creating an API that we can actually call inside of our CI/CD pipeline. And really the only manual process that we have right now in our pipeline is just a product owner getting an email and clicking a button saying, I want to release this into production. That's the only manual process we have at this point, which we have to have. We can't get around that being regulated. Getting wide adoption throughout all retail for CI/CD tooling. In the beginning, we were just really focused just on the online account opening area. And we created this tooling that was completely reusable, and Tony's going to be talking about this in a little bit. We weren't getting much traction throughout like the rest of our retail line of business. People were trying to develop the pipelines themselves and solving the same problem that we have, or maybe some other teams have already solved. So now we're more aligned to all of retail, and all of the retail line of business is starting to adopt our tooling. And this has led into another challenge of wide range of developers with different skill sets. We have the tooling, but in the beginning, like developers, we were having a little bit of difficulty actually using the tooling because their skill sets are mainly in like application engineering and not as much with like CI/CD. So we really had to ramp up a lot of our documentation and create like a lot of tutorials to enable developers to just take our tooling and just run with it and be able to spin up their infrastructure and CI/CD pipelines. So why DevOps? Deliver quality code to production faster. This is the main reason why we wanted to choose DevOps. Decrease deployment failures and eliminate massive rollbacks. Sometimes there's still rollbacks that happen. Like we do like blue-green style deployments, and we test against those instances once we do a deployment into production. But we have automated rollbacks now that happen, and you're only like rolling back like a small like feature because we break everything down into feature, releasing features. So we do that like multiple times a day. Greater efficiencies for creating infrastructure applications. This has a lot to do with the tooling that our team has created that Tony will be talking to you about next. And you build it, you own it. So we no longer wanted to just build an application, throw it over the fence again to operations, and then have them maintain that application once it's in production. So what this means is you as a developer, or as your development team, you build that application, you now actually own that application once it's in production. So you have to have monitoring, and then you're going to be on an on-call rotation, and if there's an incident in production, it's up to you to resolve that incident. So there's no more handing it over to an operations team who might not understand how that application actually works. I'll bring it over to Tony.
All right, thanks James for that bit of history and kind of where we're at and why we're doing what we're doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about more of the tooling that James mentioned that was kind of our approach and solution for CI/CD inside a retail bank. So alongside maintaining this open source Jenkins instance, one of the other things that we were developing at the same time was a unified CI/CD framework built on top of Jenkins and pretty specifically for AWS deployments as well. We called that Roswell. Our team name is Meteor, so we decided to stick with the space theme there. One of the first things that we realized is, now that we have this tool and it is a tool that's going to service, at the very least, all of retail bank, we need to find a way to develop this tool in a way that's going to be flexible for all of the different use cases that you find inside of the bank. As James said, we have 1,500 developers inside of retail, and probably as many or more different types of use cases for applications. And being a small 6-person team, we're never going to be able to implement all of those use cases for people ourselves as far as the CI/CD tool goes. And so the approach that we decided to take with the CI/CD framework, I think PayPal coined this term actually of inner sourcing, which is basically open source, but inside your organization. And so what we do is, say there's a new use case that someone needs implemented CI/CD wise, like serverless applications with Lambda for Node.js or something like that. So what we do is we find 1 or 2 teams out there in the organization who that's their use case, that's what they need. And instead of us, kind of being outside of that and just deciding, like, here's what your CI/CD process is going to look like, and here's what the tools are going to be like, we work with them to actually have them contribute that functionality back into the tool set. And this has a lot of benefits. So, the first benefit is that team now has a solid stake in the deployment process that they have for their application, which is way better than someone just handing you something and saying, like, all right, this is how you're going to do it. And then along those same lines, that team then also becomes subject matter experts on that particular use case. So the way that we have people contribute things in is not like, all right, I'm going to do this specifically for my application. It's, I'm going to do this for my application, but then our role there is to help guide them to create a solution that can be used more broadly throughout retail. And so then after that's implemented, that team really becomes, a huge force multiplier on adoption of the framework and, being able to spread that knowledge to other teams. And then because of this approach, that frees us up to work on core features of the framework, such as things that'll make it easier for people to contribute, other critical bug fixes that kind of apply across the whole thing. And so one of the other big pieces of having this unified CI/CD framework is goes back to what James was talking about with the regulated environment that we live in. And so we have all of these different processes and policies around compliance, being a fintech company, being in the fintech space. And so especially with the automated, with change management and compliance for things like PCI, And so one opportunity this affords us is the ability to codify the compliance with all of these requirements into the framework. So you as a developer, you don't have to worry about like how's my application, how's my pipeline going to be compliant for separation of duties, or how's it going to hook up to the change management system. At the same time that we were building this, Capital One at the enterprise level had started building a tool to automate the change management process. So get rid of all of these review boards and things like that. And if you had a pipeline that was fully automated, that you can prove is fully automated, you can get onto the system and do daytime what we call no-fear releases. And so we have out-of-the-box integration for this framework with that tool. So why CloudBees for us? Well, one of the biggest requirements that we had going into all of this and building this tool set was that the same way that we want to automate tests and the same way that we want to automate infrastructure and move to this you build it, you own it model of developers actually owning everything soup to nuts for their application, that includes the pipeline itself. And so what Jenkins offered us at first was the open source job DSL plugin, where you write some Groovy, you can have it provision freestyle jobs and things like that. And so that's how we codified the pipeline originally. And now we're using the newer declarative pipeline syntax with Jenkins file, which has brought a lot of benefits to the framework and applications, just in the amount of transparency that you have for the developers. It's living in their repo instead of all these Groovy files being kind of somewhere else. So executor flexibility. From the very beginning, we didn't want to have the type of executors where you have 100 different runtimes and different platforms supported on the same executor. We wanted to provide all of those base runtimes, but at the same time, we wanted to make it easy for developers, for individual applications to bring something that really fit their specific needs for their applications. And so right away we containerized the jobs with the Docker Cloud plugin at first, and then later on the ECS plugin. And so we provide like all of the base images, Java, Ruby, Python, Node, things like that. And then people can either bring their own completely, or they can inherit those images, create their own custom images, and get those into Jenkins as well. And so some features that we're really looking forward to, as James said, we're moving to the enterprise team's deployment of CloudBees Jenkins now. The biggest thing, obviously, is scalability, which just goes into being able to have multiple masters run coordinated by something like Ops Center that will just give our whole user base a much higher level of stability and performance, as well as support from both the enterprise team, because they're a team that's they have teams dedicated to Jenkins, and as well as CloudBees themselves. And then one small feature that I threw in here that we're kind of excited about is right now with open source Jenkins and Jenkins file, you can replay a pipeline job and maybe mess with the pipeline code to get it to run from a certain point in time. The whole thing is kind of kludgy, so pipeline checkpoints, something that we discovered was in Enterprise Jenkins, is a much more elegant solution to that, where you can just go and run your pipeline from a certain stage. So, what happened with all of this? Now, as of the last few months, the retail bank organization has really rallied around Roswell as the framework of choice for CI/CD within the bank organization. We've had more than 200 new projects started with Roswell, and over 50 of them are actually in production now, doing multiple production releases a day, and not going through the old legacy change management process anymore. We're really starting to track towards a critical mass of contributors from across retail bank and even a little bit outside of it now, for everything from small bug fixes to huge enhancements like adding support for UI applications like a CloudFront S3 stack with full CI/CD for the UI application that's going to be deployed into it. And then this was the big one. If you look at what our cycle times were for releases, outside of these automated pipelines, and then you look at the time it takes for these automated pipelines on Roswell to run, we you can see a reduction of almost 99% in most cases. And then this whole thing has caused us to really start thinking about expediting our move, well, not just thinking, doing, expediting our move to CloudBees Enterprise that the enterprise team maintains to better serve our user base, because then we can focus on Roswell itself. And so some lessons learned here, obviously, you can't really run 40,000 jobs on one master. CloudBees has told us a couple times that it's a miracle that the thing is even running. And so one of the big takeaways from that is, as soon as we had that explosion in our user base, numbers-wise, we should have scaled to multiple masters. Even though we weren't on enterprise at the time, we probably could have come up with a solution to coordinate those masters without something like Ops Center, and that's something that we should have done. Setting up better guardrails from the start to prevent, whether it's abuse, as in, things most people aren't trying to abuse the system, but it just happens. So, just having things in place right away, like just policies, access control, whether that's, enforced automatically or, things like documentation and things like that. And then along the same lines, when we first released Roswell, it was a little bit haphazard. And one of the big takeaways from that is, if you're going to build a product like Roswell, that's going to be a CI/CD framework or something like that, that's going to be used across your entire organization internally, you really need to treat it like a product and not just, a developer project that you use to deploy a few applications. And so we're striving to continuously improve the way that we actually develop and release Roswell as a product. And so what's next is moving from open source Jenkins to the enterprise team's offering of CloudBees, and that'll allow us to continue evolving the CI/CD framework, and hopefully not just for retail, but perhaps beyond that, further into Capital One as well.